So, if we talk about, as we just mentioned, data centers potentially being banned or limited in some US states now, could you tell me a little bit about this, Fede? Because this is kind of your realm in the energy and center world.
Yeah, I study the energy transition in the UK. I study different flexibility assets, and data centers are certainly one of the biggest topic of discussions in this field. Data centers are fundamental for the development of AI, and I think everybody has heard of them. And they sit kind of in the middle of the stack of the AI vertical sector. So obviously at the top, we have the tools that everybody uses every day, such as Claude and OpenAI, but all the models need to be trained on very large computers that are many orders of magnitude larger than what we have in our homes. And so these computers are all located into a data center. And then if we want to go at the bottom of the chain, we have the semiconductors, which are the materials used to make the data centers, as well as the energy generation, which is what powers the data centers. Now, data centers are located all over the world, but there is a clear concentration in specific countries that are usually the most developed countries, including the US and the UK. The main problem that data centers have is that they've always existed. They've existed for over 40 years, but they have never used as much energy as they're doing in these days. Whether your company has a database or uses clouds or is storing their data, this data is probably being processed by the data centers. And in order to power them, they have really large energy consumptions, really large water consumption, and at the same time, they have the tendency to make the electricity price more expensive in specific regions where they are located. So this brings a really interesting point for discussion, which is we need the data centers in order to support AI development and make every country economically more productive. But
Yeah.
at the same time, there is a risk to increase electricity prices for the locals and potentially have some environmental implications. So how do we balance the economic and environmental and social impact that these infrastructures have?
Yeah. I guess I have two questions from what you just said. Firstly, do you think that banning is pretty much to do with the price of electricity getting too high in these locations, and they're trying to stop crazy growth into the future where it will make the price just totally unsustainable for local people in those states? The second question is, do you think if the US and other more developed countries start to ban or restrict data center or new data centers being built, what does that mean for the rest of the world? Does that mean that other countries, developing countries, are going to start catching up to the West in terms of data center building and usage? And are there some ramifications to that as well?
So your first question is what is the impact and why they're banning them?
Why are they banning them? Yeah. And is that, I get the impression it's mainly due to prices of electricity. And once you get too many data centers in one place, the electricity costs go through the roof, right? Is that the main reason they're banning them?
Yeah. So, from my understanding of what I read, especially in the US, electricity prices is the main reason. And obviously, just like any other market, is a matter of demand and supply. The supply of energy hasn't gone up because there's been very few energy projects that have been built in the last few years, while the energy demand has soared because of the data centers. So the price has become more expensive for everybody in a specific region. So that could be one of the main reasons why the data centers are being banned. There is probably also a little bit of fear about AI. So there is probably some countries or states where people feel the pressure or the risk to lose their jobs to AI. And so preventing data centers from being built and expanded could be a way to fight their way back from AI taking over their job. So I would say that these are probably the two main reasons why someone would be against data centers. However, I also think that, as you said, what happens if the US or Western countries were to stop their data center developments? I think, in my opinion, what would happen is that countries like China, Russia, and other uh, countries that see the value in data centers and the value in AI will still continue to develop their own infrastructure and they will be extremely powerful. Now, there could be some economical consequences where countries that have better AI potentially have economies that are growing significantly faster. And so I think that overall, making sure that our data center growth is as sustainable possible is the key. Overall, we do want our economy to grow. We do want people to increase their salary and wealth. And so data centers are probably the way to go.
Interesting. I've got a couple more questions that come up from what you just said again.
Yeah, sure.
So if countries like Russia and China now become the leading data center locations, if the US and the West starts to ban them for these reasons, does that introduce possible security concerns in terms of important data passing through these nations that might not be friendly to the West in certain cases? Secondly, what happens if data centers move to other developing countries? It would be cheaper to build data centers in countries like Indonesia or India or Brazil, for example, in the future. These are big countries with lots of people, developing economies quite rapidly. Uh, but what does that mean, for example, for us using the data centers here? Will it become more expensive if we have to outsource the data to these other countries? Will it have negative effects on the people in those countries in terms of electricity getting more expensive? Or maybe they'll have more development in their infrastructure for that reason, and could it be helpful? What's your thoughts on those two things?
Yep. Those are great questions. I think that this brings up the problem of ownership, really. So data centers can be owned by private companies and they also can be owned by states. For instance, the Chinese government owns lots of data centers. There is almost a linear correlation between how many data centers you have and how good your AI models are, because the better infrastructure you have, the longer and more models you can train, and potentially the better AI then you develop. To some extent, there is a bit of a AI war happening, as we have said in one of our past podcasts. And if a country like Russia or China had the best AI model, they probably wouldn't use it just for the well-being of their own citizens. They might try to overthrow governments in other countries, and they can easily do that by influencing social media, stealing data in government databases. And so from a security and safety perspective, it is important that the leading models are in countries with more stable governments, specifically Europe and North America. Now, if a private company that owns a data center puts it in another country, that is perfectly. In fact, there is even companies that are trying to put data centers in space so that they don't have issues related to the laws of specific states or countries. The main issue is where the energy comes from and the latency of the model. So there is some disadvantages connecting to a data center that is further away from you. But for example, anybody just like me and you can rent a data center for a few hours to run models, and you can pick data centers all over the world. It will just perhaps take you 100 millisecond more for the data to travel from your location to the data center and back. So it's not the end of the world. But if it was owned by a government, for example, you wouldn't want your NHS data to be stored in China or in South America, for example, because for safety reasons, if there was a blackout or just the fact that the data center isn't physically in your country can be a disadvantage.
And could governments that wish to use that data or access it somehow and make that a security concern for another country? Just hypothetically, I'm not saying any country versus any other. I'm just saying, say you have one country that's not super friendly to another. This country decides to process some data in that one. Could that country then access some of it and use it against them in a sort of security troubling way?
Yeah, I mean, if it was a cyber attack, I think it would still have to go through the cyber route, but you can still unplug or cause a blackout in the data center. And the country that owns the data will then be finding themselves with no access to that data. So the risk remains.
Yeah.
From an energy perspective, powering a data center requires a lot of energy. But it is true that some companies are building data centers in companies that have either cheaper energy or just less regulation about the type of energy infrastructure that can be built. Now, if we want to assess the problem from a European and North American perspective, governments should understand the value the data centers build from an economical perspective, and at the same time realize that there are ways to make data center build-outs and powering sustainable. And this is mostly through renewable energy and the use of batteries. This would not also power the data center, but it would also strengthen the energy generation system of the country and make the country safer from an energy perspective, because now we would have better infrastructure to generate and transport the energy, but also safer from a cyber and technical perspective where we have our own data centers and we can train our own models. So I think that banning data centers is perhaps not the right strategy at the moment.
Yeah, because we've talked before about how renewable energies could work quite well with data centers. Do you think it's the case that if we start to ban or restrict them, that could be quite a short-sighted thing to do? Because yes, you're reducing the energy consumption of these massive data centers, but the future economical benefits that could be brought by having, as you say, local AI and these things may be the future of the economy in many ways, right? So if you're sort of forcibly outsourcing them to other countries, not only are you making your own economy weaker in the long term, short term, you're making developing countries' electricity more expensive. So
Yeah, you said it exactly. I think we've seen the power that AI has. We could have cheaper, more powerful AI and better renewable energy all in one country. And in the past, renewable energy also had an issue with financing because it can take, 20 to 25 years for the cost of the project to be reached and then become profitable. But at the same time, once you have a data center that is extremely profitable, you can afford to pay slightly more expensive and finance these renewable assets in a more sustainable way from a financial perspective. So the two things go hand in hand if we decide to make them work together.
yeah, it almost kind of has parallels to, manufacturing and hardcore industry, where these things kind of began in Europe and the West and then moved across the world as prices and cheapness of resources and labor became factors. And then maybe we'll see the same thing happen to data centers. But I think it's a great transition and segue to talk about renewable energy and one of our other topics we were going to talk about today, which is the Iran war and the energy price shock we're seeing because of the trouble in the Strait of Hormuz.